So, what does any of this have to do with human value? Well, consider how you define your own value. Is it by your work, utilitarian value? That can be dangerous since it's in constant flux. What if you lose your work, or if your work loses its own significance? Is it by how much you own, economic value? That's quite arbitrary, and you can't take it with you. Sentimental value, perhaps. Do you define your value by those closest to you? But then your life only matters to those few people, right? Is that right? What is your true value as a human being? Is it your value merely located in your desire to live? Existential value. Is your purpose in life just to survive? However, survival does not necessitate any measure of the quality of life and is an instinct more than a purpose, is it not? So, where does our value truly stem and where should we derive it from? The practice of delving into these philosophical definitions: existential, utilitarian, sentimental, economic. It is well worth the time to take in. And let me provide some further illustrations of the importance of these four definitions and the relationships between them. Now, as we look at those four quadrants, there are three patterns worth looking into. The first one is between sentimental and economic values. They both tend to be extremely relative due to their external nature. Sentimental value, by definition, is personal and thus not universal. It changes from person to person. Economic value is socially bound and based upon arbitrary financial systems. Due to their relative nature, sentimental and economic values are useful for social matters and are typically easily recognized. These values allow us to operate in a more efficient and smooth manner than otherwise would be possible. Sentimental value provides emotional stability, and economic value provides the foundation for trade and support. Interestingly enough, in delving into sentimental and economic value, we find that they themselves are actually quite utilitarian in their application. The second pattern we see is that utilitarian and existential values are closely related with purpose due to their internal nature. Utilitarian value tends to be defined by its utility, function, ability, and usefulness. It tends to answer the question, what does it do? When asked what is the purpose of something, the most common answer is what it does. For instance, what's the purpose of a heart? The value of the heart is its ability to pump blood to the rest of the body. That's its purpose. It's what it does. Existential value, the value within existence, comes from the distinct reason for why it was created. This answers the question, why? Consider someone coming up to you and saying, look, look what I invented. What? Well, the first question is probably going to be, what's it do? What's its function, as in the utilitarian value? The next question will probably be, why? And in this, we can see the utilitarian and existential values are very closely related to one another in their pursuit of purpose. Although they're very similar, one thing that's interesting is utilitarian tends to answer component value questions of what it does. Existential is typically comprehensive value. In our third pattern, due to their stable characteristics, sentimental and existential values are things that cannot be forcibly taken from you. If someone takes over your job and does a better job than you, your utilitarian value at work may disappear. And if a company's stock market tanks, their economic value might depreciate or even disappear. However, sentimental value and existential value are stable. They will not change due to external force. Now, sentimental value can change, but only if you let it. Existential value will never change. As long as you exist, that value will remain constant. One thing that comes from this discussion of patterns, as I hope you noticed, utilitarian and existential values are more predominant and held in higher importance than those of sentimental and economic values, due to their external value characteristics. While among the internal values, existential is more difficult to define and yet more important of the two values since it is stable and answers the all important question of why. the question we're all asking. One other thing worth mentioning when speaking about the four definitions of value is that they are not only interrelated, as illustrated earlier, but they're also interdependent. What I mean by that is that they affect one another in a bidirectional manner. Well, all except existential value. Let me show you what I mean. Economic value influences both utilitarian and sentimental value. For instance, the phrase not worth the price is an indication that the economic value is interfering with the utility of the object in question. It assumes the statement that it would be worth the price if it was not so highly priced. And that worth or desire to purchase the item is typically derived from the object's utility. And in that way, economic value directly influences the utility. For economic value's influence on sentimental value, ever heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses? Or have you ever noticed certain people or press being obsessed with anything new with the Kardashians? Economic prestige increases sentimental value. But these are merely passing examples of how economic value could potentially influence other types. Many other examples exist, and just because economic value can influence utilitarian or sentimental value doesn't mean it will in any given case. In the same fashion, however, utilitarian and sentimental value can influence economic value. Hence the bidirectional, interdependent relationship between the value systems. Utilitarian value easily influences economic value, in that economic value increases with the usefulness of the item. An item with no utility will typically have no economic value. On the other hand, name brands have higher economic value simply because of its sentimental value, hence illustrating sentimental value's potential influence upon economic value. Even further, there's a bidirectional relationship between utility and sentiment. The more useful something is, the more likely it's to be used. The more something is used, the more likely memories will form around the item and sentimental value will be placed upon it. On the other hand, regardless of which item is best, an item that has sentimental value will tend to be chosen over better options simply because of its sentimental value, thus elevating its actual utility even if a different object has higher potential utility than the sentimental object. However, this bidirectional influence is not applicable to the existential value. Existential value influences the other three value systems. However, existential value and existential value alone is undisturbed by the influence of the other three systems. Let me give you some concrete examples. If an item is created for a specific purpose or to fulfill a need, it increases the utilitarian value of the item. If an item is created with tenderness and care, especially if it's for a specific person, the sentimental value of the item increases. If an item is created to fill a demand or need, it increases the economic value of this item. In fact, that's the very basis of supply and demand. Find a demand, provide the supply. However, an item's utility does not affect existential value. Even if you use an item for something other than what it was created for, that doesn't change the existential value of that item. Whether you hold an item with high sentimentality or not doesn't affect its existence, nor does the price tag arbitrarily placed upon it by society. Now here's where the rubber meets the road, and subsequently where the controversy comes in. There are those who argue that there is no such thing as existential value. No value comes from merely existing, or so they would say. They believe value has to come from one of the other three systems. So how does one go about determining or defining existential value then? In other words, if we do in fact have existential value, just how much is that value and how can you determine it? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you create something or invent something, it could be easily argued that you, therefore, instigated the existence of that item you created or invented. So where would the existential value come from? As was mentioned before, existential value is tied closely together with purpose, in particular with the question why. Thus, we conclude by extension The existential value stems from the intent of the one who created it.